Hey, so today we're talking about installing the Free Spirit H-pipe onto your street scrambler. There are a couple of reasons why I wanted to do this. One, I wanted to reduce the heat that was coming out of the catalytic converter, and it's safe to say the H-pipe has definitely done that. The other thing I wanted to do is give the bike slightly better sound with removing that cat and giving it a little bit more of a straight through pipe to breathe through. And the sound has changed and I love the tone of the bike now. It's not super grunty still. I didn't quite want to get noise tested every time I went out on the bike, but I'm really happy with the note that the H-pipe has added. I got this from Free Spirits. I want to say a big thank you to them straight off the bat. They sent me out this pipe and it was so easy to install, and the guys over at Free Spirits were really great to deal with. So if you're thinking about getting a H-pipe, I would recommend this one wholeheartedly. All right, let's get into the install. So the first thing you're going to do is get your tools. So there's a couple of pretty straightforward tools that you're going to use on this. It's the normal Allen keys that you use when you're installing anything on the Triumph. Also a torque wrench. So that was something that I had to go out and get. If you don't have one, it's probably a good time to get one. They come in really handy. I've had a couple of jobs where I've needed this now, so I'm really glad I've grabbed it. So grab yourself a torque wrench and a simple shifter and a socket set as well will get you through pretty much the whole install. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is take off the heat shields. On my bike, it's the black heat shield because I've got the Arten Works on mine. On yours, it's probably silver, and you're going to remove that with your Allen key. Be really careful when you pull this off because there's a couple of parts to the heat shield, and pretty much every bolt that we use, we're putting back on the bike. So make sure you retain the bolts and the little sort of rubber washers that sit and kind of hold those bolts on nicely and absorb some of the vibration. So you're taking that main heat shield off and then you're moving up to the black one that's sitting over the top of the catalytic converter. There's one bolt that holds this on, but just be careful when you pull it off. There's two little rubber sort of nubbins that sit on top of the mounting points, and you want to make sure you keep those as well. I'll show you a couple of tips later on for getting those back on because they can be a bit tricky, but again, we want to retain all of these parts so that we can refit the heat shields back to the bike once the H-pipe is on. All right, so once you've removed the heat shields, we're moving on to taking both of the exhaust pipes off the bike. The easiest way to do this is to start with the main bolt that's, it's an Allen key bolt and it's holding the two pipes together right at the very end of the bike. You might need a slightly longer Allen key for this, but my standard one fit okay. I've got pretty small sort of slight hands, so I was able to get in there okay, but a slightly longer Allen key might help you with that. And again, retain that bolt because you're putting it back on later. Once you've taken that main bolt out, you then want to move back up the bike and you want to loosen the collar that's holding the exhaust pipe to the catalytic converter. You want to make sure that you put this either on the exhaust pipe or rest it on the catalytic converter. Either way, you just don't want it to fall to the ground. I put mine from memory on my exhaust pipe, so try and do that just so you're not mixing parts up. Then you want to move up to the main sort of nut and bolt that's holding the exhaust pipe to the bike. You need to be careful with this because on either side of this bolt there is these little silver hi-hats and they drop out quite easily. It's not a big problem if they drop out. You just want to make sure that you retain them, you know where they've gone, because you need them when you put the exhaust pipes back on the bike. So once you've taken that out, you should be able to gently wiggle the top exhaust pipe off. And one tip I've got for you right now is to start making sure you're laying your parts out in a way that kind of visually represents where they've come off the bike. I always do this. I lay it on the ground next to the bike so that I can tell where the parts have come off, and I can roughly orientate myself if I've lost a part and I'm trying to locate it. So that's just a little tip. You don't have to do it, but I find it's a good way to keep track of bits and pieces. So once you've taken the top one off, you can go ahead and repeat the same process for the bottom one, and then you'll notice that you're pretty much halfway. You've taken all those heat shields off, you've taken the exhaust pipes off, so now we can go back up to the other end of the bike and we can start to take off the collar, the O2 sensor, and that other collar that's sitting in sort of tucked behind the engine as well. I've got a couple of tips with this step because it is a little bit tricky. First of all, when you're loosening the main collar, the top collar near the O2 sensor, just do it gently and make sure you're paying attention to how the collar comes off. It comes off in two parts and it does need to go back on in reverse. So just get an idea of how those two parts sit together. Once you've taken the collar off, you can take the O2 sensor off. I took this off with a shifter. I was just very gentle to get it loose, and then once it was loose, I very gently unwound it with my fingers. It is attached to the bike, so that cord may or may not turn. It can feel like there's a little bit of resistance on it, so just go gently, and then once that's off, you can tuck that up and away so that it's kind of out of the way while you're trying to get all these other parts off. Once you've done that, you can then get your Allen key and you can loosen that collar that's kind of tucked in behind the engine for the bottom pipe. This can be a little bit tricky, and there was no real easy way to do this. I had a small Allen key that fit in that gap, and I just very gently and slowly worked it around until I was able to loosen it off with my fingers. And then you're at a point where you've pretty much loosened the whole catalytic converter off and you're about to take it off. When you take it off, there will be a seal that's on the bottom pipe. I didn't use that again because that gasket won't fit on with the new H pipe, but we'll talk about how I worked around that in a little bit. So this is the part where you want to pull the catalytic converter off, and it can feel a little bit intimidating because it does require a little bit of coercing. So the best way I found to do this was to give it a little bit of a wriggle so you can feel that it's starting to come away from the bike, and you want the catalytic converter to come out of the top part of the engine first, and that means you can kind of rotate around that bottom pipe. If you do it that way, if you give it a little bit of a wiggle and the top part starts to come out, then you're able to pull the bottom part away quite cleanly, and your catalytic converter should come away cleanly at that point. So once you've taken the catalytic converter off, you can transfer those two tabs that are on the cat. You want to make sure they go into the H pipe in the exact same spot, because without those, you're not going to get a good solid seal when you start to screw the heat shields back on. So make sure you transfer those tabs, and now you can put the H pipe back onto the bike in the same spot that you just took the catalytic converter off. Now, here's the thing. On my bike, because that gasket can't stay on, I ended up using a copper gasket sealant. It worked really well. So essentially you put sealant onto the pipe, and then I was able to place the H pipe over the top and tighten up that collar and get a really, really good seal around the two pipes. I haven't had an issue with it. It's been working good, and I also got my mechanic to check it over and he said the seal's great. If you're lucky enough to have a bike that can keep that gasket on there, it's just as simple as slipping the H-pipe back over the gasket and things should tighten up normally. But like I said, if you're on a newer scrambler like I am, get some gasket sealant and it'll work just fine. Now it's essentially just doing everything back in reverse. So once you've got that collar in the right place, you can then go ahead and position that top part of the H-pipe back into the engine. This is a little bit tricky because you've kind of got to do both of these things at once. But again, I found the best way is to try and loosely position it with the bottom pipe on, and then you want to rotate that top pipe into the engine rather than trying to, I guess, move the bolts. The bolts will pretty much stay in the same spot and you want to move the pipe into position that way. Then you can place the collar back over the top and gently start to screw the bolts back into place. With the O2 sensor, so this is another tip that I have. By winding it back the opposite way to the way you're about to tighten it, it will make it a lot easier to tighten properly. It means it'll spin back into position and you won't kind of be forcing it around as you're trying to tighten it up. So that's one of my tips for getting the O2 sensor back in. It's a little bit of trial and error, but hopefully the way I've explained it has made it clear that you basically want to wind it back on itself, physically turn it around so that the coil is kind of spinning and you can see there's a little bit of tension in it. And then as you screw it back in, that tension will unwind and it should be roughly in the right position. So once you've got the O2 sensor in, the collars are in, that normal kind of trick of not tightening everything up definitely goes for a lot of these parts, just as you're trying to get the mufflers into position and get everything sort of all good. This goes for the bottom muffler, but once you get the top one once you're ready to put the top one on, you definitely have to tighten the bottom one up. So for now, get the bottom muffler and put it back on pretty much in reverse to the way we took it off. Remember to have those hi-hats, the little silver hi-hats in the right spot so that everything is where it should be and you've got all the pieces ready to tighten that bolt up. So now you're basically doing things in reverse. So the bottom one on first, do up that collar nice and tight, make sure it's roughly aligned, do that collar up, do the bolt up at the bottom nice and tight, both of those nice and tight now because you're not going to be able to get to those again. And then the top muffler can go on. So at this point it can get a little tricky because there's a few different points that you really need to be aware of that need to line up. So one of them is, remember that initial bolt that we took out, that needs to go back in place eventually. And there's also a small overlapping tab that lines up for the heat shield. This will all go into place. It's just a little bit of trial and error, and that's why I've said not to tighten up the H-pipe too much other than the bottom exhaust, because you won't be able to get access to that once you've got the top exhaust back on. So just make sure you're putting things back exactly where they were and give things a little bit of a wriggle so that you can get those bolts back in nice and cleanly when you're ready to put the exhaust shields back on. So now that you've got both of those exhaust pipes back on, it's time to torque up the bolts that are on the H-pipe where they attach to the engine. So you want to torque these to 19 Newton meters. I can't tell you how to use your torque wrench because every torque wrench is a little bit different, but obviously you want to set it to 19 and tighten it up to that. You don't want to over tighten these too much. So once you've got your collar on, now tighten the other the other collar as well, the one behind that we were talking about before. Again, it's a little bit fiddly, and you can position it to make it a little bit easier to get to this time. You can kind of turn it around just to make it a little bit easier to get in there with the Allen key, but it's just patience and making sure that you tighten that up nice and tight. At this point, if you're like me and you've got the new Street Scrambler, that sealant should start to be drying okay, but remember, that type of sealant, gasket sealant, normally takes about 24 to 48 hours to dry properly. All right, now that you've got the H-pipe nice and tight and you've tightened up every part of the exhaust as well, now it's time to put the heat shields on. And this is that one that gets a little bit tricky with the rubber tabs. I tried a few different ways to do this. It really comes down to trial and error, but the way that I did it was I got those two black tabs, I put them on the little mounting points, and then I was able to push the black shield back over the top and kind of wriggle them into place. Then you can put that bolt in. If that doesn't work for you, the other way you can try is to put those rubber stoppers onto the inside of the heat shield and then do sort of the reverse where, yeah, you're pushing it onto the mounting points that way. It really depends on the day, the weather, a whole heap of things, but trying either of those ways will hopefully help you get that heat shield back into place. It is tempting to put it on without those rubber stoppers, but I highly advise against that. Obviously, those rubber stoppers are there to help absorb some of the vibration that's coming off the pipe and ultimately not wear those parts out. So please make sure you stick with those rubber stoppers. Once you've fiddled around with that, it could take you 5 minutes, it could take you 20, but once you've got that in place, then you can screw that bolt in. And then you're pretty much in the home stretch. You're just putting that heat shield back into place. The only tricky part with this is, like we were talking about before, the two exhausts have that one mounting point that kind of need to line up. So getting that as close to straight as possible is obviously going to take that bolt in properly. So try and get that aligned and then just bolt that back on. Make sure everything's nice and tight. Start the bike up. Make sure it sounds all okay, and you're pretty much done. So, like I said, I really wanted to make sure I included a couple of the little tips and tricks that I learned from installing this. If I can do it, I reckon anyone can do it. As long as you take it slowly, go at your own pace, and make sure you're really pedantic about retaining those bolts and keeping things in the right order, everything will go back on just fine. I really love this pipe. It's so much better on the bike now, although it is winter here in Australia and the bike's actually a lot cooler, so I am, kind of regretting installing it in winter. It was a little bit of a rude shock not to quite have that nice warm pipe in the mornings, but hey, in summer, I'm sure I'll thank myself for installing this. If you've got any tips or if you've done this install and I've missed anything, please add it to the comments below. Hopefully this is a really great place for people to add their tips and tricks and help people that are installing this themselves in future. As always, stay friendly, ride daily, and I'll see you next time.